And it must be on point. But now here's what's really interesting. I'm going to read you a quote from the ADL. Now, they have attacked final judgment, as you all know. But what was very interesting, what was very, very interesting was that when this eruption broke out down in Orange County, they had to adopt a new position on the JFK assassination. The ADL was saying, oh, well, there are a lot of responsible conspiracy theorists. This is the first time I ever heard the ADL say that conspiracy theories were responsible. They actually said that, well, there are a lot of mainstream conspiracy theorists who could have been invited rather than Mr. Piper. That's what they said to the public, okay? In other words, well, Mr. Piper's not mainstream, but some conspiracy theorists are. So don't invite him. Well, here is what Abe Foxman, the head of the ADL, said several years ago, before he knew I was going to be invited to Orange County. This is very interesting. If segments of the population are really willing to believe that President Kennedy was killed by the military-industrial complex because he was too soft on communism, or that a secret group of Bavarian Freemasons has controlled the secular left for more than 200 years, then it is not hard to imagine some of these same people falling for the lies of Bradley Smith, I think a lot of you know who Bradley Smith is, or the fabrications of Louis Farrakhan and Leonard Jeffries. All of these conspiracy theories share the core feature that the quote-unquote research which supports them, little more in fact than a compendium of anecdotes divorced from their original context, that's a mouthful, is rigged to arrive at predetermined conclusions, not historical revelations or insights. Now that is a mouthful, but what they're saying is that even if you believe that the military-industrial complex, whatever the military-industrial complex is, if you believe that they were involved in the JFK assassination, then you believe something that you shouldn't believe. That's what they say in some crazy book. It's not crazy to them, though, but Anti-Semitism in America, Outspoken Experts Explode the Myths. A book that only a Semite or an anti-Semite, I suppose, would read, not a normal human being. Needless to say, this was their in-house party line before my book got out to the public. Then when my book got out to the public, of course, they changed their tune and decided that, well, or at least they told the public this, well, it's okay to believe in conspiracy theories. But God forbid you should believe in the one that Mike Piper is promoting. Now, that's kind of interesting. You know, I understand why they want to keep it quiet. I mean, if you look at it, if they did it, and I believe they did it, then they got to keep that quiet because, you know, there's a big thing here. I would say that probably any of you in here who were voting in 1960, you probably didn't vote for John F. Kennedy, unless your views changed. And I know as a child, I used to get involved in arguments with my father because I used to say things like, well, I'm glad they shot Kennedy. I knew that would press his button and he'd get mad. Well, I'm not glad they shot John Kennedy. I'm not glad that anybody gets shot. But that's what I used to say to my father. But the thing about it is, I could have never imagined the things that I know about John F. Kennedy today to be true at one time, nor would I have ever thought that I would have written a book saying, hey, well, Kennedy wasn't such a bad guy after all. And that isn't really what I say in the book. I do say that John F. Kennedy cut deals with the mob. He cut deals with the Israeli lobby. You know, he cut a lot of deals to get elected president. And then, when he didn't exactly follow through on his deals, particularly in the realm of his deals with Israel, he got assassinated. Now, where do you find the Israeli connection? Okay, first of all, let me give you the motive. And you have to read the book to get the full picture, and I'm trying to break this down because it's a very complicated thing. The bottom line of it is, the bottom line motive for Israeli involvement is the fact that John F. Kennedy was trying to stop Israel from building the nuclear bomb. That was probably, according to all the sources, they're not right-wing sources. They're, you know, we have Stephen Green, who is Jewish, Seymour Hersh, who is Jewish, Andrew and Leslie Coburn, they're not Jewish, but they're respected, quote-unquote, mainstream liberal journalists. They have all documented the fact that John F. Kennedy was involved in a behind-the-scenes war with Israel over Israel's attempt to build a nuclear bomb. Now, everybody knows that John F. Kennedy had his troubles with the CIA over Cuba, and everybody knows that the U.S. got involved in Vietnam after John F. Kennedy's assassination. What people don't know, unless they've read these rather esoteric books on U.S. Middle East policy, is that upon John F. Kennedy's assassination, U.S. policy towards Israel did a complete 180-degree turnaround. And as Stephen Green puts it, it essentially made Israel the 51st state. Now, that's all well and good. That's all documented in the book. But just because that happened doesn't mean that there's an Israeli connection to the assassination. I realize that. And my book does not provide any, how should I put this? My book doesn't provide any smoking gun. My book doesn't provide any evidence that could bring an indictment against anybody. But what it does do, it assembles as much evidence, as much detail, as much, probably more so, information about the conspiracy, the depth and breadth of the conspiracy as any other book on the subject. And that, as I say, is probably its strong point, and that is where the actual Israeli connection comes in the assassination conspiracy. Now, much of my thesis is based around the role of Clay Shaw. Now, if you saw the movie JFK, you know who Clay Shaw was. Now, I'm going to dissect the Clay Shaw connection here because it is important. But I do want to digress for a moment and say this because it's important to emphasize it, that Clay Shaw, if Clay Shaw had never existed, if he had never been alive, my thesis would still stand. But the fact is that Clay Shaw did live, and if you look at the Clay Shaw connection, you do see very clearly the Mossad connection. And I do believe Jim Garrison was right. I do believe that Clay Shaw was connected in some way to the conspiracy. I don't necessarily believe that Clay Shaw knew that John F. Kennedy was going to be assassinated, any more than Lee Harvey Oswald did. But I do believe that Clay Shaw was involved in some way with the elements that were involved in the actual mechanics of the conspiracy and the planning of the conspiracy, and that as a consequence of that, that's how Jim Garrison, as District Attorney of New Orleans, came up with his name. And maybe when Clay Shaw said, you know, when he proclaimed his innocence, maybe he truly believed he was innocent. But there were a lot of people who were linked in some way to the JFK assassination who, because they happened to be in a certain place at a certain time, people always say, aha, that's the proof. Now, I mentioned earlier today at a meeting where I spoke that for years I've been reading that the proof that Richard Nixon was involved in the JFK assassination conspiracy, I put the word proof in quotes, was that Nixon was in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed. Well, there were a lot of people in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed. Well, guess who I just found out a few days ago was in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed? Yitzhak Rabin, the future Prime Minister of Israel. Now, like I say, that's an interesting little detail. It doesn't prove that he was involved in the conspiracy. It doesn't prove that the Israelis were involved in the conspiracy. But it's a detail that nobody knows about. Whereas everybody knows about the Richard Nixon thing. It's easy. This is the kind of thing, what I constantly tell people is that the basic stories you get about the JFK assassination conspiracy, they give you part of the picture. You don't get the full picture. You know, you're looking, or they tell you to look over here, when in fact you should be looking over here. And in the new edition of my book, I put together a couple charts that I think, and I'm going to try to use this blackboard here, and I hope, I don't see, there's an eraser. I'm glad you have it here, because I think maybe I can explain my theory best by giving you a few little drawings, and I can draw fairly well, so this might work. I have one theory which I call the Mossad box theory. See this box, this pretty box right here? That's the Mossad connection to the JFK conspiracy. My box, you can easily fit the CIA did it theory in there. You can put the theory that the Mafia did it. You can put the French connection in there. And believe it or not, you can even put the right-wingers in there. And And I'll explain that in a minute because that's a very interesting story. All of these things taken together